It all began in 1960, when the cargo ship Aurora left the calm shores of Australia for yet another routine voyage. The sky was clear, the sea breeze carried the typical freshness of the early hours of navigation, and the crew maintained their usual confidence, born from familiarity with the dangers and challenges of the sea. On deck, men adjusted ropes, checked equipment, and exchanged trivial conversations, while others gazed at the horizon, well accustomed to the endless expanse of blue stretching uninterrupted. For them, it was just another job, a journey expected to run its course without major surprises. The crew was composed of seasoned sailors, hardened by years of work at sea, men who viewed the ocean as both a source of livelihood and an entity to be respected. To them, the Aurora was more than a ship. It was a home, a shelter from the misfortunes of the outside world. And while there were whispered tales about the perils of the deep waters, such legends were rarely taken seriously. "The ocean is treacherous, but it's not magical," said Captain Hollis, a man known for his practical and stern leadership. The first days of the journey were calm, with the ship steadily heading toward the Atlantic. The sun shone intensely during the day, and at night, the starry sky seemed to stretch on forever. It was a routine the men knew well, almost monotonous, marked by the familiar sounds of the ship's engine, the wind in the sails, and the waves striking the hull. On the third night, the weather changed. The sky was clear, with a full moon casting its silvery light over the waters, but there was something different in the air. Some men mentioned a sense of unease, an inexplicable heaviness that seemed to spread across the entire ship. Sailor Briggs remarked that it felt as if the ocean itself was watching, but most laughed, dismissing his words as superstition. Still, the growing discomfort was impossible to ignore. As the night wore on, the crew tried to maintain their routine. On deck, the night shift was in full swing, with men quietly tending to their tasks or simply gazing at the moonlit horizon. Everything seemed calm, except for one detail that few noticed. The sound of the sea was different. Normally, the waves had a steady rhythm, but now there was something irregular, a kind of murmur that seemed to rise from the depths. Some thought it was just the wind, but others felt an inexplicable chill. Shortly after midnight, a strange sound pierced the silence. It was faint, but carried a melody that no one aboard the Aurora could describe. Briggs was the first to hear it and alerted the others, but the men around him simply frowned, saying he was imagining things. However, as the minutes passed, the sound grew clearer, more distinct, until everyone realized it wasn't their imagination. It was something real and sinister. The melody seemed to come from all directions. It wasn't an ordinary tune. There was something about it that unsettled the senses, an irresistible call that made the men stop what they were doing and look around in confusion. Briggs called for Captain Hollis, who appeared on deck with a skeptical expression, but it took only a few moments for him to hear the sound as well. The captain frowned, visibly uneasy, and ordered the men to stay alert. As they ventured deeper into mysterious waters, the melody persisted, and the tension aboard the ship grew. Some men began murmuring prayers, while others curled up, trying to ignore the sound that seemed to seep into their minds. What frightened them most wasn't the music itself, but the feeling that something was approaching. There was nothing visible on the horizon, no nearby storm, yet the atmosphere aboard the Aurora was shifting. Then a scream tore through the air. One of the sailors on the port side of the deck was pointing at the sea, his eyes wide with terror. Everyone rushed to see what had happened, but there was nothing but calm water reflecting the moonlight. The man insisted he had seen something, a shape moving beneath the surface, large and fast. Some laughed it off, claiming it was just a fish or perhaps his imagination playing tricks, but the captain wasn't so sure. He ordered the crew to double their vigilance, though no one knew exactly what to look for. As the night wore on, the sound grew even louder, accompanied by an increasing sense of being watched. Some sailors began complaining of headaches, while others reported a strange pressure in their chests, as if something invisible was pressing down on them. The melody seemed to have a physical effect, weakening their minds and sapping their strength, and yet no one could ignore it. By dawn, the Aurora was shrouded in a heavy silence. The melody had ceased, but the damage had been done. The men were restless, exchanging nervous glances and speaking in whispers. Some began recalling stories of missing sailors and legends of the Atlantic's creatures. The captain tried to maintain order, but even he seemed shaken, for he knew it was the cursed sirens or sea nymphs. Something was happening, something no one aboard the ship could understand. It was in this state of tension that the crew faced the rest of the night, their eyes fixed on the horizon and their ears tuned to the faintest sound. The ocean, vast and dark, now felt more threatening than ever, and the Aurora, once a fortress, seemed like a small piece of driftwood in a world of bizarre mysteries. The first light of dawn brought some relief to the ship's crew. The sky, painted in shades of orange and pink, seemed like a promise of normalcy. Yet the unease lingered. Men who would normally start their day with a cup of coffee and idle chatter now worked in silence, casting furtive glances at the sea. It was as if the daylight couldn't erase the shadow that had settled in their minds. Captain Hollis decided he couldn't allow fear to take hold of his crew. He called a meeting on the deck, gathering the men around him. His presence usually inspired confidence, but that morning, even his rigid posture and authoritative tone seemed insufficient. He spoke of focus, of not letting superstitions or irrational fears take over. "We're men of the sea," he said. "The ocean is unpredictable, yes, but we will not bow our heads. Our strength lies in discipline and hard work. Don't let last night make you forget that." Despite his words, it was clear the mood aboard had changed. Small incidents began to occur. Equipment that had been checked the night before now showed inexplicable malfunctions. Cargo that had been securely fastened appeared misaligned. The radio, which had been working perfectly until then, started emitting nothing but static, making communication with the mainland impossible. Each new issue seemed to fuel the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong. Later that afternoon, the first sailor disappeared. Briggs, the same man who had alerted them to the melody the previous night, vanished without a trace. One of the crew members swore he had last seen him near the ship's rail, staring out at the sea. When they searched for him, all they found was his cap, caught on a rope near the deck. The initial assumption was that he had fallen overboard, but the absence of any sound or unusual movement cast doubt on that theory. The captain ordered an immediate search, but after hours of combing the area around the ship, there was no sign of Briggs. He had disappeared without a trace. Briggs's disappearance plunged the crew into a state of paranoia. No one wanted to be alone. Even simple tasks, like checking equipment in the hold, were now done in pairs. Stories and theories began circulating among the men. Some claimed Briggs had been taken by something from the depths, a creature that had called to him with the melody from the night before. Others believed he had gone mad and thrown himself into the sea, unable to cope with the tension. But no one knew for certain. That night, the sound returned. This time, it wasn't a distant melody, but something more intense, closer, as if it were emerging from the very hull of the ship. The rhythm was irregular, almost hypnotic, and it brought with it a sensation of vertigo that left several sailors paralyzed. Some covered their ears, others curled up in silence, while Captain Hollis desperately tried to give orders, his voice weak amidst the chaos. There was nothing visible around the Aurora, but everyone knew they were not alone. Then, something resembling thousands of dolphins seemed to be moving toward the ship. The men rushed to the sides of the deck, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. "Hold your positions!" Hollis shouted, but panic had already consumed many. At that moment, something emerged from the waters. It was a breathtakingly beautiful blonde woman with a fish-like lower body, appearing in a hypnotic, almost otherworldly way. She was singing the melody the men had heard before. No one dared approach her, but all were overtaken by a mix of fascination and terror. What followed was pure chaos. Some sailors began walking toward the mesmerizing blonde-haired siren as if they were in a trance, while others tried to stop them, shouting and struggling to pull them back. Captain Hollis grabbed one man by the arm, but the sailor seemed oblivious, his eyes fixed on the beautiful siren. One by one, those under the spell began leaping into the sea, swimming toward her. No matter how much the others tried to stop them, it was as though a greater force was drawing them into this sinister trap. Gradually, the men disappeared into the dark waters of the ocean. The silence that followed was chilling. Of the sailors who had entered the water, none returned. Those who remained aboard the ship were in shock, many unable to speak or even move. Hollis, now visibly shaken, tried to maintain his composure, but his face betrayed his despair. He ordered the remaining crew to double their vigilance and forbade anyone, under any circumstances, from approaching the ship's edges. By the time the night ended, the Aurora drifted aimlessly, its crew reduced and shattered. But the men knew this was not the end. Whatever lay in the depths was still there, waiting. And the melody, now etched into their minds, seemed like a warning. The ocean would never reveal all its secrets without demanding a price. The South Atlantic seemed vaster and more desolate than ever. The waters, once churned by towering waves, were now eerily calm. The ocean's silence was more terrifying than the roar of any storm. The disappearance of so many men, coupled with the inability to explain the events surrounding them, had drained the crew of their strength. Each man wrestled with his own fear and the haunting memories of the previous night. Captain Hollis stood firm, but the signs of wear were impossible to ignore in his expression. His voice, once commanding and authoritative, now sounded rougher, as if the weight of responsibility was slowly crushing his resolve. He had gathered the remaining crew in the main hall to discuss their next move. It was a small group now, barely more than a dozen weary faces, many of whom could hardly bring themselves to look at him. "We need to keep heading north," Hollis began, his voice cutting through the heavy silence in the room. "The faster we leave these waters, the better. We don't know what else we might face, but whatever it is, we can't give it more chances." "Captain," interrupted Rourke, the oldest sailor in the group, his voice laden with fear. "Do you really think leaving here will be that simple? Those things know where we are. They found us once. Who's to say they won't find us again?" Hollis hesitated, but only for a moment. "Maybe we can't avoid them, but we can prepare. Reinforce the deck, arm yourselves with whatever you can find. If we're attacked again, we won't go down without a fight." The captain's words offered some reassurance to the men, but it was clear that everyone was aware of the futility of their situation. Fortifying a ship against something they couldn't understand felt as useless as building walls against the wind. Still, they clung to the task, because working was better than thinking. As the crew reinforced the ship with planks, chains, and anything else they could use as protection, a sailor named Carter called attention to something strange. "Look at the horizon," he said, pointing eastward. The sky, once an unbroken expanse of blue, was now tinged with an unusual shade of gray. The clouds spiraled slowly, as if a storm were brewing. The air felt heavy, carrying a salty, rotten stench that made the men wrinkle their noses. It was a foreboding sight. Whatever lay ahead wasn't going to be kind. Captain Hollis ordered them to maintain course, but the crew couldn't tear their eyes away from the horizon. The spirals in the clouds seemed to be moving toward the ship, growing in size and density. A murmur of unease began to spread among the men, but no one dared to voice what they were all thinking: that this was no natural storm. Just before sunset, the ship was engulfed in a thick fog that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Visibility dropped to nearly nothing, and the absolute silence was replaced by a low, constant sound, like the distant groaning of something unseen. It was impossible to pinpoint its source, but it seemed to come from all directions at once. "To your posts," Hollis ordered. The men obeyed, but the fear was palpable. Suddenly, something slammed against the hull of the ship, causing it to rock. At first, the sailors thought they had struck some kind of submerged rock, but when they rushed to look, all they saw was the dense fog and the dark water below. "Watch out!" shouted one of the men, pointing to the side of the ship through the mist. It was them. The mermaids emerged slowly from the waters, their seductive beauty glowing in the dim light of the evening. At first glance, they were breathtaking, but any allure was shattered by their proximity. Their eyes were black and endless, like voids that sucked in all the light around them. Their smiles, wide and twisted, revealed rows of sharp teeth that gleamed like blades. "Don't look at them!" Hollis shouted, but it was too late for some. Two men began walking toward the railing, drawn by the soft singing that now filled the air. Hollis, with Rourke's help, managed to grab one of the men before he jumped, but the other had already disappeared into the water. "Weapons ready," ordered the captain, and the crew began firing at the creatures. The bullets seemed to hit their targets, but the mermaids kept moving. Some began climbing the hull of the ship, their sharp claws leaving deep marks in the wood as they scaled it with terrifying agility. The battle was chaotic. The sailors used whatever they had at hand: rifles, knives, pieces of wood. Each creature that was repelled seemed to be replaced by another, as if the ocean was pouring an endless army against them. The sound of their singing grew louder, more penetrating, as if it was invading their minds and weakening their strength. One of them reached the deck, where it attacked a group of 3 sailors. With a swift movement, it grabbed one by the neck and threw him into the sea before the others could react. Hollis faced another with a knife, managing to wound her in the face, but she merely laughed before retreating back into the water. The captain looked around, trying to assess the situation, but the chaos was absolute. Men were running in every direction, shouting, fighting, falling. It was then that those damned mermaids, in perfect synchronization, stopped attacking directly and began circling the ship, creating whirlpools in the water. The ship started to rock violently, and the deck tilted dangerously. "Hold on!" shouted Hollis, but the force of the water was overwhelming. A final cry of desperation echoed through the ship before silence returned. The mermaids disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only devastation in their wake. When the fog finally lifted, the Aurora was adrift once again, its sails torn and the deck marked by the battle. The remaining men were exhausted, both physically and mentally, and they knew this wouldn't be the last time they would face the terror of the depths. The Aurora seemed like a ghost ship, floating through the dark waters of the Atlantic, carrying the desolate souls of a crew that, even though alive, no longer knew what it truly meant to be alive. The silence on the deck was thick, a silence that weighed more than any scream or explosion. A few days ago, the ship was a sturdy vessel, proud of its purpose. Now, it was a monument of wear and despair, a reflection of what remained of the men who were still aboard. Captain Hollis, despite maintaining the facade of leadership, was clearly on the verge of madness. His eyes were hollow, as if he no longer saw the world around him, only the darkness closing in on them. His steps were heavy, his hand trembled slightly when he held the wheel. He was no longer the confident man who commanded the ship with assurance. That night, a thick fog overtook the Aurora again, much thicker than the previous ones. The sky, covered by clouds that seemed to merge with the horizon, was impenetrable. The moon, a distant presence, could barely cut through the dark shroud that spread across the sky. The wind was still, and the sound of the sea seemed to have completely vanished. I hid behind a stack of crates, holding a knife as though that could protect me. My heart beat so fast that I could hardly breathe, knowing it might be my last night alive. The survivors, the few who still managed to keep their sanity, gathered in the ship's salon. Fear was written on every face, but there was also something else, something harder to describe. "We can't go on like this," said Briggs, his voice trembling. "They're here. They're still here. No matter where we go, we'll never escape." I was ready to face it all again, but I ended up falling asleep that terrifying night, and thank God I saw the dawn with everyone safe. One of the sailors shouted as he spotted something in the distance that morning. We looked and saw some lifeless bodies lying on the wreckage of a smaller boat, adrift, as if they had been in the sea for weeks. The Aurora was never the same after that hallucinatory voyage. Neither were we. Somehow, against all odds, we managed to reach the coast. No one celebrated. Of the 35 men who had set sail from Australia, only 12 returned. 12 empty souls, marked by scars that went beyond the body. As for me, I left the sea for a few years. I can't even look at the ocean without tasting the bitter fear. The newspapers never told the true story of the ship Aurora. They said it was a cursed voyage, marked by inexplicable tragedies. But the survivors know the truth. We tried to warn others, to tell them about the mermaids that lured sailors with their enchanting songs and angelic faces. But they weren't the romantic figures the fairy tales described. The mermaids were predators, monsters disguised in beauty to attract their prey. And when the sailors got too close, they dragged them into the depths, where the bodies were never found. But no one believed us. We were ridiculed, treated as madmen. Sometimes at night when the world is quiet, I still hear that melody. It's faint, like a distant echo, but it's there. I don't know if it's my mind playing tricks on me or if they are still calling me. And that's the part that scares me the most. The ocean holds secrets that man should never try to unravel. I used to think it was just a sailor's saying, but now I know it's a terrible truth. There are things out there, in the depths, that were not meant for human eyes. And if one day you hear music coming from the waters, a sweet and irresistible melody, do what I couldn't do. Run.